You still sleep beside each other, you still say goodnight, you still call each other baby, but it's not the same anymore, is it? There's a distance now, not measured in inches, but in silence. You lie there, phones glowing in the dark, scrolling through worlds that don't include each other. You laugh at things they'll never see. You cry over thoughts they'll never know. And somewhere in between those quiet moments, you realize the person beside you feels more like a memory than a partner. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. Love rarely dies in a storm. It fades in soft, invisible ways. A missed touch, an ignored question. A moment you tell yourself doesn't matter until one day it does. Now the bed feels colder, the conversation shorter, and every smile feels rehearsed. You're not fighting. You're not angry. You're just absent. Two people, sharing space, but living in separate timelines. You remember how it used to be. The late night talks, the uncontrollable laughter, the warmth of falling asleep holding hands. Now it's the glow of two screens, two worlds, two minds that used to orbit each other, now drifting further apart, quietly, politely, invisibly. And the cruelest part? You still care, you still love, you just don't feel close, because intimacy doesn't die when love ends. It dies when presence disappears, when you stop looking at each other and start living beside each other. That's the real tragedy. Not the breakup, not the loss, but the quiet in between, when you realize you're both still here, and somehow still alone. Section 2. The comfort that kills. It's strange, isn't it? How the thing that once made you feel safe can start to feel like a cage. You used to crave their presence, their touch, their voice, the way they looked at you when you didn't even notice. Now it's routine. Now it's background noise. You've learned their patterns, their habits, their sighs. You've memorized every part of them, and somehow that mystery you once loved turned into predictability. They don't surprise you anymore, and you don't try to surprise them. That's what kills love, not hate, but comfort. The kind that wraps around you slowly, convincing you that effort isn't needed anymore, that you already have each other, so why keep chasing? You stop dressing up for them. You stop asking how their day was, because you already know the answer. You stop reaching out first, because you assume they will. And slowly, without realizing it, you trade connection for convenience. You replace meaning with maintenance. You start managing the relationship instead of living inside it. You wake up beside the same person every day, but you no longer see them. They become a part of the furniture, a constant presence that no longer feels alive, and when they look at you, you can tell they feel the same. There's no anger there, just a quiet sadness, like both of you know something beautiful has faded. But neither has the courage to say it out loud, because comfort feels safe, and safe feels easier than change, so you stay. You tell yourself this is normal, you convince yourself this is what real love becomes, but deep down, you remember how it used to feel, how it burned, how it thrilled, how it moved you. Now it just exists, and that's the part that hurts the most. You didn't stop loving them, you just stopped feeling alive with them. That's what comfort does. It doesn't destroy you suddenly, it softens you slowly, until the person who once made your heart race now just helps you sleep. Section 3. The distraction era. There was a time when being together meant being there. Now it just means being in the same room. You're both present, but your minds are elsewhere. Your hands are busy scrolling, typing, checking, but your hearts are idle. You reach for your phone before you reach for each other. You share reels, not conversations. You send memes instead of meaning. And the saddest part, it feels normal now. We've mistaken stimulation for intimacy. We don't talk, we text. We don't listen, we wait for our turn to reply. We don't look into eyes, we look into screens. Dinner tables used to echo with laughter. Now they glow with blue light. Two people, sitting inches apart, lost in different digital worlds. The room feels full, but the silence is deafening. It's not that you stopped caring, you just got distracted by 1,000 little things that mean nothing. By updates, notifications, endless noise, you let the outside world walk straight into your love and pull it apart one scroll at a time. Love requires presence, it requires stillness, it requires two people who are actually there. But today, everyone's half here, half gone, their bodies in one place, their attention scattered across 1,000,000 pixels. You can't fall in love when you're not paying attention. You can't build closeness in between alerts, because intimacy needs time and distraction devours it. So you start talking less, not because there's nothing to say, but because there's no space left to listen. You start touching less, not because you don't want to, but because the warmth of the screen feels easier than the warmth of skin. And before you even realize it, you're living parallel lives, online together, offline apart. Love isn't dying because people stop loving. It's dying because people stop showing up. And in this era, distraction isn't just a bad habit, it's the slowest, quietest way to lose someone who's still sitting right next to you. Section 4. The loss of curiosity. In the beginning, you couldn't stop asking questions. You wanted to know everything. Their stories, their fears, their scars, the way they took their coffee, the songs that made them cry. Every detail felt sacred. Every silence felt meaningful. Because curiosity is love in motion. It's the desire to understand someone so deeply that their soul feels seen. But over time, that hunger fades. You stop asking, you stop listening, you start assuming. You think you already know them, their moods, their habits, their dreams, but you don't realize how much has changed. People don't stay the same. They grow, they hide, they evolve. And when curiosity dies, love starts speaking an outdated language. You're still talking, but not about anything that matters. It's logistics now. Bills, chores, plans, empty noise to fill the quiet. And every time you choose small talk over soul talk, the distance grows. You used to ask, "What are you thinking?" Now you just say, "Did you feed the dog?" That's how intimacy dies. Not through betrayal, but through boredom. Because curiosity is the heartbeat of love. Without it, connection becomes memory. You stop noticing new things about them. You stop seeing the little changes, the way their smile doesn't reach their eyes anymore, the way they hesitate before saying, "I'm fine." You think you know them, but you only know the version that existed years ago, and they feel it too, the quiet ache of being unseen, of existing beside someone who no longer wonders who you are. That's when the relationship begins to suffocate, not from lack of passion, but from lack of curiosity, because love isn't a destination, it's a discovery, and once you stop exploring the person you love, you stop finding reasons to stay. Section 5. The emotional shutdown. It doesn't happen in a fight, it happens in a sigh. The kind of sigh you let out when you realize you've said the same thing 100 times and nothing changes. So you stop explaining, you stop trying to be understood, you stop expecting the other person to see you. That's the beginning of emotional shutdown, not anger, not resentment, just quiet surrender. You start swallowing your feelings instead of expressing them. You smile when you're sad, you nod when you disagree, you pretend it's fine because pretending feels easier than being ignored. And they do the same. You both build walls, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. You stop asking what's wrong because you already know the answer, nothing. And even if something is wrong, you both know neither of you has the energy to fix it, so you coexist, like strangers who used to be lovers. Every conversation feels heavy, every silence feels safe. It's easier to say nothing than to risk another misunderstanding. That's the quiet death of emotional intimacy, when peace replaces passion, not because you're healed, but because you've given up fighting. You start living around each other instead of with each other. The spark is gone, but so is the noise, and that false calm feels like comfort, but it's just distance disguised as peace. You begin to mourn them while they're still here. You begin to grieve the closeness you once had while you're still in the same bed. And maybe the saddest part is, you convince yourself this is normal, that love just fades, that this is what maturity looks like, but it's not. It's survival. Two people too tired to leave, too afraid to talk, and too numb to care. That's the emotional shutdown, not the end of love, but the end of its heartbeat. Section 6. The intimacy illusion. You still touch, you still kiss. Sometimes you still make love, but it's not the same, is it? It feels like routine now, a habit, not a hunger, a moment of relief, not connection. The body remembers what the heart forgot. You call it intimacy, but it's more like escape, a way to feel something, anything, even if it's temporary. The truth is, physical closeness isn't emotional closeness. You can hold someone all night and still feel miles apart. You can kiss them and still ache with loneliness. Because real intimacy isn't skin, it's soul. It's what happens when two people see each other without filters, without fear, without ego. But that's too rare now. We've mistaken attention for affection. We've confused validation for love. We chase the feeling of being wanted, not the reality of being known. So you keep going through the motions, touching without tenderness, kissing without depth, making love without presence. And afterwards, the silence feels louder than before. They roll over, you check your phone, and for a moment you wonder if this is what everyone means when they say relationships take work. But deep down you know it's not work, it's performance. Two actors playing the parts of lovers, pretending they still feel something. The world taught us that intimacy is physical, that connection is chemistry, that closeness means contact. But that's the illusion, because real intimacy isn't about how much you touch, it's about how much you care when you don't have to. It's about the honesty that comes when no one's watching, the conversations that happen without words, and once you lose that, no amount of touch can bring it back. You can't fix emotional distance with physical closeness. It only reminds you of what's missing. That's the intimacy illusion, the moment when love still looks alive, but you can feel it dying in your hands. Section 7. The outsourcing of love. We used to turn toward each other. Now we turn to our phones. We post about love more than we practice it. We seek advice from strangers who've never met us. We talk about our partners online more than we talk to them in person. Love isn't private anymore. It's performative, curated, packaged for validation. Every argument becomes a quote. Every confession becomes content. And every lonely night becomes a status update, disguised as empowerment. That's what it means to outsource love, to hand it over to the world for opinions, instead of protecting it in silence. When things go wrong, you don't reach for each other anymore. You reach for distraction, someone to message, a comment section to scroll through, a post to remind yourself you're worth it. And for a moment, it works. You feel seen, you feel heard, you feel enough. But only for a moment, because those little bursts of attention aren't connection. They're anesthesia. They numb the pain of disconnection without ever healing it. You start to live two versions of yourself, the one that performs love for the world and the one that goes home to silence. The one that posts self-love quotes but still sleeps beside someone who doesn't look at you anymore. The one that preaches independence but checks their phone for someone to text. We've confused exposure with expression. We think that sharing everything makes us honest, but it only makes us hollow, because love was never meant to be a broadcast. It was meant to be a bond. And the more we invite the world into our relationships, the less space there is for truth to breathe. Love needs privacy to survive. It needs stillness, mystery, and sacred silence. But in a world that rewards visibility, we've forgotten how to be invisible together. That's the cost of modern connection. We share everything with everyone, and end up feeling known by no one. Section 8. The quiet breakup. Some relationships don't end with screaming. They end with silence. No one packs their bags. No one blocks anyone. No one slams a door. You just stop showing up. It's quiet, almost peaceful. You wake up one day and realize you've already let go. You just haven't said it out loud yet. The conversations fade first, then the touches, then the laughter, until what's left is routine, dressed as love. You still do the things couples do, dinners, errands, holidays, but it all feels hollow, like you're watching a rerun of your own life. You smile for photos, you post the right captions, you tell people, we're good. But when the lights go off, you both turn to opposite sides of the bed and fall asleep wondering how long it's been since you actually felt anything. That's the quiet breakup. No big moment, no dramatic goodbye, just a slow, invisible unraveling that no one notices except you. You stop planning the future, you stop missing them when they're gone, you stop caring whether they're happy, because somewhere deep down you already know you're not part of their happiness anymore. And the worst part, you start pretending that this is okay, that this is what mature love looks like, that this is what happens to everyone eventually. You tell yourself you've outgrown passion, that peace is better than pain, but it's not peace, it's numbness. You both start living parallel lives, close enough to reach, too far to connect. It's a breakup without closure, an ending without an ending, a slow death that no one mourns because technically you're still together. That's what makes it so tragic. You're still in love, just not with each other. You're in love with the memory of who you used to be. And every night you lie there, breathing the same air, wondering how something that once felt so infinite could vanish so quietly. That's the quiet breakup, when you stop being lovers but keep pretending to be. Section 9. The reckoning. Ran, there comes a moment in every quiet breakup when you finally ask yourself, what happened to us? Not with anger, not with blame, just with a kind of calm disbelief. How did something that once felt infinite shrink into silence? How did love that once felt like home become a place you both avoid? And then you realize it didn't die suddenly. It starved of curiosity, of attention, of small moments that used to feed it. Love doesn't vanish. It fades from neglect. You don't lose it because someone stopped caring. You lose it because both of you stopped trying. You started living next to each other instead of with each other. You traded connection for convenience, passion for peace, conversation for comfort. You thought being together was enough. But love isn't about proximity, it's about presence. You can't touch someone's heart if you've stopped touching their mind. That's the reckoning. The moment you see what love truly needs. It doesn't ask for perfection. It doesn't even ask to last forever. It just asks to be nurtured, to be watered with effort, protected from neglect, kept alive through the small, everyday choices that say, I still choose you, because intimacy doesn't die in a single moment. It dies from 1,000 missed chances to care. The long days where no one reaches out, the quiet nights where both assume the other doesn't want to talk, the mornings where you scroll instead of touch. That's how love dies. Not from betrayal, but from absence. But here's the truth. It doesn't have to stay dead, because the same small things that kill intimacy are the same small things that can revive it. A look, a touch, a question asked with real curiosity, a silence shared without fear. That's where love lives. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet attention. And if you're lucky enough to find someone still lying beside you, even after all the distance, even after all the silence, don't waste the chance to begin again. Because sometimes, love doesn't need a miracle. It just needs two people brave enough to look at each other again and whisper the words that start everything over. I still see you.